blood, steel, and the thunder of 100,000 hooves shaking the earth. Picture this, a city of 100 to 200,000 souls thriving on the Silk Road, its walls gleaming under the Persian sun. Within days, it becomes a graveyard. Every man, woman and child executed. Every dog and cat slaughtered. The corpses piled so high they block out the horizon. The ground ploughed over as if the city never existed. This wasn't fiction. This was Nishapur in 1221, and it was just one of dozens of cities that felt the wrath of the Mongol horde. For 40 years, one name struck terror into the hearts of emperors from Beijing to Budapest: Genghis Khan, a man born clutching blood in his fist, who rose from slavery and starvation to forge the most brutal military machine in human history. His armies didn't just conquer territory. They erased civilizations. They turned rivers red with blood. They built pyramids from the skulls of their enemies, and they did it with a precision and savagery that still haunts history books today. This is not a story of glory. This is the brutal truth of warfare at its most primal and devastating. This is how one man and his horde of warriors from the steppes brought the world to its knees. This is the story of annihilation. Before we dive into the carnage, if you're fascinated by the brutal reality of warfare and the darkest chapters of military history, smash that like button and subscribe to Wars in History. Hit the notification bell because we're going deep into the blood-soaked campaigns that shaped our world. Now, let's witness the rise of the greatest conqueror history has ever known. The year is 1162. In the frozen wilderness of northern Mongolia, near the Onon River, a child is born into a world of violence and betrayal. His name is Temujin. According to the secret history of the Mongols, he entered this world gripping a blood clot in his tiny fist, an omen that he would become a great leader who would wade through rivers of blood. His father, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, constantly fighting for survival against rival tribes in the harsh Mongolian steppes. This was a world where mercy was weakness, and strength was the only currency that mattered. Temujin's childhood was shattered when his father was poisoned by rival Tatars during a feast. The boy was only 9 years old. With Yesugei dead, his clan abandoned Temujin's family, leaving his mother Holun to raise her children alone in the wilderness. They survived on wild fruits, ox carcasses, and whatever small game Temujin and his brothers could hunt. Starvation was constant. Death lurked in every shadow. This brutal existence forged something dark and unstoppable inside the boy. The violence escalated when Temujin's older half-brother Begta began asserting dominance over the family, threatening to claim their mother as his wife according to steppe tradition. During a hunting expedition, Temujin and his brother Kasar made a cold calculation. They murdered Begta, shooting him down with arrows. Their mother was horrified, but Temujin had learned his first lesson in power. Eliminate threats before they eliminate you. He was barely a teenager, and he had already killed to survive. The steppes were unforgiving to the weak. Around 1177, Temujin was captured by the Taijiyud clan, former allies of his dead father who now saw him as a threat. They enslaved him, locking him in a kang, a wooden portable prison that immobilized his neck and wrists. But Temujin refused to break. During a feast, when his captors were drunk and distracted, he escaped into the night, hiding in a river crevice until dawn. A sympathetic guard helped him flee, and this daring escape earned Temujin a reputation for cunning and resilience. Warriors began to take notice. His fortunes changed when his wife, Borte, was kidnapped by the Merkit tribe in revenge for an old grudge. Temujin formed an alliance with Ong Khan, a powerful tribal leader, and together they launched a brutal raid to rescue her. They slaughtered the Merkits and recovered Borte, though she gave birth to a son whose paternity was uncertain. Temujin accepted the child as his own, demonstrating a pragmatic ruthlessness that would define his rule. What mattered was power and loyalty, not bloodlines alone. By the early 1180s, Temujin broke from his childhood friend Jamuka, who had become a rival for dominance over the Mongol tribes. The two former blood brothers now faced each other as enemies in a brutal power struggle. Temujin began consolidating tribes under his banner, offering a revolutionary proposition. He would promote men based on merit and loyalty rather than aristocratic bloodlines. Warriors who followed him would share in the spoils of war. Obedience to his Yasa code of law would bring wealth and power. Betrayal would bring death. The conflict with Jamuka came to a head at the Battle of Dahlan, Baljut in 1187, where Temujin suffered a devastating defeat. But he learned from failure. He refined his tactics, strengthened his alliances, and never made the same mistake twice. Over the next decade, he methodically defeated or absorbed rival clans, using a combination of military brilliance and psychological warfare. Those who submitted were spared and integrated into his growing army. Those who resisted were annihilated, their warriors executed, their women and children distributed among Mongol households. By 1206, Temujin had unified the fractious Mongol tribes under a single banner for the first time in history. At a great gathering called a Kurultai near the sacred Burkan Khaldun mountain, the tribal chiefs proclaimed him Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. He was 44 years old. He had transformed himself from a starving orphan into the supreme leader of the Mongol nation. And he had created something unprecedented, a massive, disciplined army organized not by tribal loyalty, but by a decimal system of tens, hundreds, thousands, and tumens of 10,000 warriors. But Genghis Khan's ambitions didn't stop at the steppes. He looked beyond the horizons of Mongolia and saw wealthy civilizations ripe for conquest. The Jin dynasty controlled northern China with its glittering cities and advanced technology. The Khwarezmian Empire dominated Central Asia and Persia, controlling the Silk Road and its unimaginable riches. Europe lay beyond, fat with kingdoms that knew nothing of the storm gathering in the east. Genghis Khan had forged his weapon in the crucible of the steppes. Now he would test it against empires. Now he would show the world what true warfare looked like, and the world would drown in blood. Genghis Khan understood something fundamental about power that most conquerors missed. Tribal loyalty was the enemy of empire. For centuries the Mongol tribes had fought each other in endless cycles of revenge and blood, feuds, their strength scattered across the steppes in dozens of competing clans. Men fought for their blood relatives, answered only to their clan chiefs, and viewed outsiders with suspicion and hatred. This system kept the Mongols divided, weak, and at each other's throats. When Genghis Khan declared himself supreme ruler in 1206, he didn't just unite the tribes through conquest. He shattered the entire social structure and rebuilt it from the ground up, creating something revolutionary that would terrify the world. The foundation of his new order was the decimal military system, borrowed and adapted from earlier steppe confederations but implemented with unprecedented rigor. Every single warrior in the Mongol army was assigned to a unit of 10 called an arban, commanded by an arban odaga who was personally responsible for his men's discipline, training, and performance. 10 arbans formed a jagun of 100 men under a jagutu indaga. 10 jaguns created a mingan of 1,000 warriors led by a minganu noyan, and 10 mingans comprised a tumen, the devastating force of 10,000 horsemen that would become the signature unit of Mongol warfare, capable of operating independently across hundreds of miles of territory. But this wasn't merely an organizational chart. It was social engineering on a scale never attempted before. Genghis Khan deliberately mixed men from different tribes, clans, and even former enemy groups within each Arban. A Mongol warrior might find himself fighting alongside men whose fathers had killed his uncles, whose tribes had raided his family's herds, whose clans had been mortal enemies for generations. The old loyalties were deliberately destroyed and replaced with loyalty to the Arban, the Tumen, and ultimately to Genghis Khan himself. This mixing was mandatory and permanent. A warrior was assigned to his Arban for life, and it was forbidden under penalty of death to leave and join another unit for any reason, whether religious, cultural, ethnic, or personal. Your Arban brothers became your family. You ate with them, trained with them, fought with them, and died with them. The man watching your back in battle might have been your tribal enemy a year ago, but now your survival depended on him, and his depended on you. This created bonds stronger than blood, forged in shared hardship and combat. The old tribal structure was dead, replaced by a meritocratic hierarchy, where promotion came through proven ability in battle, not aristocratic bloodlines or clan connections. A common herder could rise to command thousands if he proved his worth through courage, tactical skill, and absolute loyalty to the Khan. The command structure itself was brutally efficient. Orders flowed down from the Khan through the Noyan commanders to the captains of hundreds and tens. Each level of command had clear authority and clear responsibility. If a unit failed, its commander was held accountable. If a unit succeeded, its commander was rewarded with plunder, status, and further authority. This created a system where competence was rewarded and incompetence was eliminated. Commanders who won battles through clever tactics were studied and promoted. Commanders who lost through stupidity or cowardice were executed, often publicly, as examples to others. The discipline imposed on this new army was absolute, enforced through the Yasa, Genghis Khan's code of law that governed Mongol military and civilian life. While the complete text has not survived, later sources describe it as comprehensive and brutally enforced. The Yasa was more than a legal code. It was a system of total control designed to eliminate weakness, enforce obedience, and create a warrior culture where the collective good outweighed individual life. The punishments were brutal, designed not just to punish offenders, but to terrify potential violators into compliance. Death was the standard penalty for most military offences, but the method of execution varied based on social rank and the nature of the crime. Common soldiers were typically beheaded, a quick death that at least offered the mercy of speed. Nobles and commanders who violated the Yasa were killed by having their backs broken, a method that avoided spilling their blood, which was considered sacred in Mongol tradition. This wasn't mercy, it was a slower, more agonizing death, but one that respected the spiritual significance of noble blood, even as it punished the person who carried it. Traitors, deserters, and those who committed particularly heinous crimes might be executed by being trampled under horses, torn apart by bent trees released simultaneously, or subjected to other creative forms of public execution, designed to maximize suffering and serve as warnings. The offences that carried the death penalty were extensive and often shockingly minor by modern standards. If a soldier failed to pick up something dropped by the warrior riding in front of him, during a march he would be executed publicly in front of his unit. This wasn't about the dropped item. It was about attention to detail, awareness of your surroundings, and the collective responsibility that every warrior bore. If you couldn't be trusted to notice and retrieve a dropped water flask, how could you be trusted to notice an enemy ambush or follow complex tactical orders in the chaos of battle? Desertion carried the harshest penalties, and not just for the deserter. If one man in an Arban fled during battle, the entire unit of 10 would be executed. If an entire Arban fled, the Jagun to which it belonged would be decimated, with every 10th man killed. This created a system where survival depended on collective courage. You couldn't run because your brothers would die for your cowardice, and they couldn't run because you would die for theirs. This mutual accountability forged units that would fight to the death rather than break, because breaking meant everyone died. Anyway, theft within the army was punishable by death. Drunkenness during a campaign was punishable by death. Unauthorized absence from your unit was punishable by death. Failure to maintain your equipment was punishable by severe beating for the first offense and death for the second. Even minor breaches of military etiquette could result in public humiliation, beating, or loss of rank. The message was clear. The Mongol army was not a collection of individual warriors. It was a single organism, and every cell within that organism had to function perfectly or be excised. Western chroniclers who witnessed the Mongol invasions often dismissed the Mongol horses as inferior beasts, small, shaggy, ugly creatures that looked more like oversized ponies than proper war horses. Compared to the massive European destriers or the sleek Arabian stallions, the Mongolian horse seemed laughably inadequate. They stood only 12 to 14 hands high, barely reaching the shoulder of a tall man. They had thick, heavy coats, short legs, and large heads that gave them an ungainly appearance. European knights and Chinese generals looked at these animals and assumed they faced a disadvantage. They were catastrophically wrong. The Mongolian horse was the product of thousands of years of natural selection in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Mongolian steppes experienced temperature extremes from minus 40 degrees Celsius in winter to plus 40 degrees in summer. Food is scarce, water sources are scattered, and survival requires endurance, intelligence, and the ability to forage independently. The horses that survived in this environment were the toughest animals on the planet, and the Mongols had been breeding them for warfare since before recorded history began. These horses could survive on vegetation that would starve European war horses to death. They didn't need grain or prepared feed. They could paw through snow to reach frozen grass, eat bark from trees, and thrive on the sparse vegetation of the steppes. This meant Mongol armies didn't need massive supply trains of fodder following behind them. The horses fed themselves by grazing during rest periods and overnight stops. This single characteristic gave the Mongols a logistical advantage that their enemies couldn't match. While European and Chinese armies crawled slowly forward, limited by the speed of their supply wagons, Mongol Tumans moved at terrifying speed, living off the land. The endurance of these horses was legendary and well documented by both Mongol sources and horrified foreign observers. A Mongolian horse could travel 80 kilometers per day, day after day, in extreme weather conditions while carrying a fully equipped warrior and his gear. They required minimal rest and recovered from exertion with remarkable speed. During forced marches, Mongol armies could cover 200 kilometers in 3 days, a pace that seemed impossible to medieval armies accustomed to moving, 20 to 30 kilometers per day. Each Mongol warrior traveled with a string of 3 to 5 horses, sometimes more for important campaigns. This wasn't excess, it was tactical necessity. By rotating between horses every few hours, a warrior could maintain punishing speeds without exhausting any single animal. If a horse was wounded or went lame, the warrior had immediate replacements. This system meant that Mongol armies could sustain high-speed operations for weeks without pause, appearing hundreds of miles from their last known position and catching enemies completely unprepared. The horses themselves were trained for warfare from birth. They learned to tolerate the chaos of battle, the screams of men, the clash of weapons, the smell of blood. They were conditioned to respond to leg commands since riders needed both hands for bows and weapons. The most prized war horses were mares, particularly lactating mares, because warriors could drink their milk during long campaigns. Airag, or fermented mare's milk, was a staple of the Mongol diet, providing nutrition and slight intoxication that helped warriors endure hardship. A warrior could survive for days on nothing but airag drawn from his horse, making the Mongol army nearly self-sufficient even in territories stripped of food. If the Mongolian horse was the strategic foundation of Mongol military dominance, the composite bow was its tactical expression. This weapon represented centuries of accumulated knowledge in materials science, engineering, and battlefield effectiveness. To call it simply a bow is to miss its significance. It was one of the most sophisticated weapons systems developed in the pre-gunpowder era, and in the hands of a trained Mongol warrior, it could kill with precision at distances that seemed like sorcery to medieval armies. The construction of a Mongol composite bow was a year-long process requiring master craftsmanship. The core was made from multiple layers of different materials, each chosen for specific mechanical properties. The belly of the bow, facing the archer, was constructed from horn, typically water buffalo horn or ibex horn, which resisted compression. The back of the bow was made from sinew, usually from deer or cattle, which excelled at handling tension. Between these layers was a core of flexible wood, usually birch or bamboo. These materials were laminated together using fish glue, then wrapped in birch bark or leather to protect the bow from moisture, and the entire construction was left to cure for at least a year, sometimes longer. The result was a recurved bow that, when unstrung, curved forward in the opposite direction from its shooting configuration. This recurved design stored enormous amounts of energy in the limbs. Despite its relatively compact size, around 4 feet in length, perfect for use on horseback, a Mongol composite bow had a draw weight between 100 and 160 pounds. European longbows, by comparison, typically had draw weights of 60 to 80 pounds. This massive draw weight translated directly into power. A heavy war arrow fired from a Mongol bow could penetrate chainmail at 200 yards, kill an unarmoured man at 300 yards, and wound at even greater distances. But power meant nothing without accuracy, and this is where Mongol training created warriors who seemed superhuman to their enemies. Archery training began in early childhood, around age 3 or 4, as soon as a child had the strength to pull a small bow. Young children practiced on stationary targets, learning the fundamentals of stance, draw, aim, and release. By age 6 or 7, they were shooting from horseback at walking speed, learning to time their shots with the horse's gait. By age 10, they were shooting at full gallop, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization with the animal beneath them. The training was relentless and unforgiving. A boy who wanted to become a warrior needed to hit targets consistently while riding at full speed, which meant mastering skills that seem almost impossible. He had to control his horse entirely with his legs and weight distribution, since both hands were occupied with the bow. He had to time his shot for the moment when all 4 of the horse's hooves were off the ground, the only instant during a gallop when the horse's motion was smooth enough for an accurate shot. He had to compensate for wind, for the speed of his horse, for the movement of his target, and for the arc of the arrow, all while riding at 30 miles per hour across rough terrain. The most devastating technique in the Mongol archery arsenal was the Parthian shot, named after the ancient Parthian cavalry that first mastered it. This maneuver involved shooting backwards while retreating at full gallop. To execute it, a warrior had to twist his entire upper body around in the saddle, maintain perfect balance on a galloping horse, track a pursuing target behind him, and loose an accurate shot all simultaneously. This required years of training and produced warriors who could inflict casualties on pursuing enemies while apparently fleeing in disarray. Western knights and Chinese infantry who chased retreating Mongols found themselves riding into killing storms of arrows fired from impossible angles. A fully trained Mongol archer carried multiple quivers, typically holding 60 arrows each, giving him 120 to 180 arrows readily available. The arrows themselves were specialized for different purposes. Light arrows with small, sharp heads were used for long-range harassment, able to fly farther but with less penetrating power. Heavy arrows with broad, barbed heads were designed to punch through armor and create devastating wounds. Whistling arrows with perforated bulbs behind the points created distinctive screaming sounds used for signaling commands across the battlefield. One whistle pattern might mean wheel left, another feigned retreat, another full charge. Incendiary arrows wrapped in cloth soaked in naphtha or animal fat could set fire to wooden fortifications, siege equipment, and supply wagons. Mongol military supremacy wasn't created on the battlefield. It was created in childhood, through a training system that turned every male Mongol into a warrior from birth. The process began before a child could walk. Infants were tied to horses, held in place by parents or older siblings, getting accustomed to the motion and rhythm of riding before they had conscious memory. By age 3, children rode independently on gentle horses, learning balance and basic control. By age 5, they were riding alone across the steppes, herding animals and learning to navigate vast distances. This early training wasn't sport or recreation. It was survival education in a society where being unable to ride meant death. The steppes were unforgiving to those who couldn't move quickly, and mobility meant horses. Children who fell behind the tribe during migrations could freeze, starve, or be caught by raiders. The ability to stay mounted, to control your horse in rough terrain, and to ride for hours without exhaustion wasn't optional. It was the baseline requirement for existence. Alongside horsemanship came archery. As soon as a child's hands were strong enough to pull a small bow, usually around age 3 or 4, they began shooting at targets. The training started with stationary practice, learning proper form, and developing the back and shoulder muscles required for archery. By age 6, children competed in informal contests, shooting at targets from increasingly difficult positions. By age 8, they were shooting from horseback. By age 10, they were hunting small game independently, learning to track, to read the land, and to survive alone in the wilderness for days at a time. Wrestling was the third pillar of Mongol warrior training, considered essential for building strength, courage, and combat instincts. Mongol wrestling, or bulk, wasn't the stylized sport of modern Mongolia. It was brutal hand-to-hand combat training designed to teach boys how to grapple, throw, and dominate an opponent. Matches had no time limits and no weight classes. You fought until someone's back, knee, or elbow touched the ground. This trained boys to fight through pain, to never give up, and to find ways to overcome larger, stronger opponents through technique and determination. Genghis Khan himself considered wrestling essential for maintaining his army's readiness and organised regular tournaments among his troops. These three skills, horsemanship, archery and wrestling, were codified in the Nadam festival, which originated as a way to keep warriors trained and ready during peacetime. But Mongol warrior training went far beyond these core competencies. Boys learned to hunt using eagles, training these massive birds of prey to kill wolves and foxes. They learned to survive in extreme cold, building shelters from snow and ice. They learned to find water in the desert, to navigate by the stars, to read weather patterns, and to track enemies across vast distances. They learned to slaughter animals, butcher meat, cure hides, and make their own equipment from raw materials. By the time a Mongol boy reached fighting age, usually around 14 or 15, he was a complete warrior. He could ride for days without rest, hit targets from horseback at full gallop, fight hand-to-hand, survive alone in the wilderness, repair his own equipment, and navigate across hundreds of miles of featureless terrain. Western European knights spent years training in castles and training yards. Chinese soldiers drilled in organised formations. Mongol warriors had been training since they could walk, and their entire society was organised around producing the most effective cavalry soldiers in the world. While Mongol warfare is remembered for its male warriors, the military system couldn't have functioned without the crucial role played by Mongol women. Unlike most medieval societies where women were excluded from martial culture, Mongol women were integrated into the military infrastructure in ways that gave their armies strategic advantages their enemies lacked. Many Mongol women were trained in horsemanship and archery from childhood, just like the men. They could ride, shoot, and fight when necessary, and some did so with distinction. Historical accounts mention women warriors who fought alongside men during critical battles, and several of Genghis Khan's daughters became military commanders in their own right. But the primary role of women in Mongol warfare was logistical, and this role was absolutely critical to military success. Mongol armies moved with their households, bringing their families, herds, and portable yurt dwellings on campaign. The women were responsible for managing this entire mobile infrastructure. They packed and unpacked the yurts, loaded everything onto the massive four-wheeled carts pulled by oxen, drove these carts across hundreds of miles of rough terrain, and then set up camp again. A single woman would often control a train of 20 to 30 connected carts, guiding them across flat steppes, then unhooking them to navigate rough terrain individually. This created a supply system that could move nearly as fast as the armies themselves. While European armies relied on slow supply wagons driven by civilian contractors who would abandon the army at the first sign of danger, Mongol armies travelled with their families who were personally invested in victory and willing to endure extraordinary hardships. The women managed food supplies, treated wounded warriors, maintained equipment, herded the replacement horses, produced arrows and other ammunition, and handled the thousands of logistical details that kept an army functional. When Mongol armies surrounded enemy cities, women managed the siege camps, often under fire from defensive artillery. They drove the supply carts forward to feed the army, built and maintained the siege equipment under the direction of Chinese and Persian engineers, and sometimes participated directly in assaults. Western chroniclers who witnessed Mongol sieges often expressed shock at seeing women working within arrow range of enemy walls, apparently fearless of the danger. This wasn't recklessness. It was the reality of a nomadic military culture where women shared the risks and hardships of warfare because their survival depended on the army's success. Some elite Mongol women wielded even greater power. The Khatun's wives of the Khan and major nobles controlled the orders the household camps, even after their husbands died. They administered vast territories, commanded their own military units, and made strategic decisions. Genghis Khan's daughters were married to allied rulers as a way of binding those rulers to Mongol authority, but they weren't passive pawns. They spied on their husbands, reported back to Genghis Khan, and in several cases, essentially ruled their husbands' kingdoms as representatives of Mongol power. This use of women as political agents was another innovation that gave the Mongols intelligence advantages over enemies who dismissed women as militarily irrelevant. The Mongol military machine required more than just warriors and horses. It required information, and the Mongols developed the most sophisticated intelligence and communication network the medieval world had ever seen. The foundation of this system was the Yam, a network of relay stations spaced every 20 to 30 miles across the entire empire. Each Yam station maintained fresh horses, food, water, and rest facilities for authorized messengers. A messenger carrying orders from the Khan could arrive at a Yam station, switch to a fresh horse without breaking pace, and continue riding. This allowed messages to travel 200 to 300 miles per day, a speed that seemed impossible to societies where messages travelled at walking speed. The messengers themselves, called arrow riders because of their speed, were elite warriors selected for their endurance and reliability. They carried paisas, metal tablets inscribed with authority from the Khan himself, which commanded absolute obedience from anyone they encountered. An arrow rider could requisition food, horses, guides, or military escort from any Mongol subject. Refusing an arrow rider was refusing the Khan, a crime punishable by death. This system meant that intelligence from the front lines could reach Mongol headquarters in days rather than weeks, and orders from the Khan could reach armies thousands of miles away before enemies even knew a decision had been made. But the Yam was only part of the intelligence network. The Mongols employed spies and informants on a scale that wouldn't be matched until modern intelligence agencies. Merchants travelling the Silk Road were recruited or coerced into gathering information about cities, fortifications, political situations, and military strengths. Religious travellers, Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, Christian missionaries were questioned extensively about the lands they had visited. Defectors from enemy armies were welcomed, debriefed, and often incorporated into Mongol forces, bringing detailed knowledge of enemy tactics and weaknesses. Before invading a region, Mongol commanders would spend months or even years collecting intelligence. They would know the terrain intimately, including water sources, mountain passes, and potential ambush sites. They would know the political situation, identifying factions that could be turned against each other. They would know the military capabilities of their enemies, including army sizes, equipment quality, commander personalities, and likely tactical responses. This intelligence preparation meant that by the time the Mongol army appeared, the campaign was already half won. Enemies found themselves facing an opponent who knew their land better than they did, and had already identified and exploited their weaknesses. Religion played a crucial role in Mongol military culture, though not in the way it functioned in Christian or Islamic armies. The Mongols practiced a form of animistic shamanism centered on the worship of Tengri, the eternal blue sky, considered the supreme deity who ruled over all creation. Genghis Khan claimed his mandate to conquer came directly from Tengri, who had set aside the whole world as Temujin and his son's domain, according to shamans who advised him. This wasn't just political propaganda. It was a genuine belief that gave Mongol warriors a sense of divine destiny that made them extraordinarily dangerous. Mongol warriors believed they were instruments of heaven's will, destined to conquer the world. This created a fatalistic courage where death in battle was accepted as predetermined by Tengri. If it was your time to die, you would die, whether you fought bravely or fled like a coward. Since fleeing wouldn't save you, you might as well fight with maximum ferocity and at least die with honor. This mindset produced armies that fought with reckless aggression, accepting casualties that would break the morale of other forces. Shamans accompanied Mongol armies on campaign, conducting rituals before battles to ensure Tengri's favor, reading omens in weather patterns and animal behavior, and treating wounded warriors using a combination of practical medicine and spiritual healing. The shamans also served psychological functions, boosting morale through ceremonies and providing explanations for setbacks that maintained faith in ultimate victory. If a battle was lost, it wasn't because the Mongols were inferior, it was because the timing wasn't right, because spirits had warned against that particular day, or because some ritual requirement hadn't been met. The Mongols were surprisingly tolerant of other religions not out of modern liberal values but out of strategic pragmatism. Genghis Khan and his successors exempted religious figures from taxation and conscription. Across their empire, Christian priests, Buddhist monks, Muslim imams and Taoist sages all received protection. This wasn't generosity. It was psychological warfare. By protecting religious institutions, the Mongols removed a major source of potential resistance and gained allies who could preach submission to Mongol rule as God's will. Many conquered peoples were told by their own religious leaders that resisting the Mongols was resisting divine judgment, a message that undermined morale more effectively than any military threat. One of the most significant Mongol military advantages was their ability to sustain armies with minimal supply infrastructure. While European and Chinese armies required massive wagon trains of food, fodder and equipment that limited their speed and range, Mongol armies were largely self-sufficient. This capability stemmed from their nomadic culture where survival meant extracting resources from harsh environments. Mongol warriors ate a diet that horrified foreign observers but provided everything needed for sustained campaign operations. The staple was airag, fermented mare's milk, which provided calories, vitamins and slight alcohol content that helped preserve it during long journeys. Warriors could survive for days on airag alone, supplemented by dried meat and curd. During forced marches, warriors would sometimes cut their horses' necks and drink small amounts of blood mixed with milk, getting nutrition without slaughtering the animals they depended on for transportation. When operating in the enemy territory, Mongol armies practiced systematic requisition that was indistinguishable from organized looting. They would seize grain stores, livestock, and supplies from conquered regions, stripping the land of resources that could sustain their armies while denying those same resources to enemies. Civilians who cooperated were often spared and incorporated into Mongol supply systems. Those who resisted were killed and their supplies taken anyway. This created a mobile supply system where the army fed itself from the territories it conquered, allowing campaigns to continue indefinitely without waiting for supplies from homeland territories. The Mongols also mastered the art of battlefield salvage. After victories, they would strip enemy dead of anything useful: weapons, armor, clothing, food, horses. Captured enemy equipment was immediately put to use or melted down for raw materials. Captured soldiers who possessed useful skills, blacksmiths, carpenters, engineers were pressed into Mongol service, often under threat of death if they refused. This meant that Mongol armies actually grew stronger as campaigns progressed, absorbing enemy resources and expertise rather than depleting their own reserves. Genghis Khan had forged his weapon. Every element had been tested, refined, and perfected through brutal experience. The organizational structure ensured obedience and coordination. The training produced warriors of unmatched individual skill. The horses provided mobility that no enemy could match. The composite bow delivered a firepower at ranges that seemed impossible. The intelligence network provided information advantages that made Mongol commanders seem omniscient. The logistics system allowed operations across vast distances without cumbersome supply lines. And the warrior culture, bound by iron discipline and driven by divine mandate, created armies that fought with a ferocity that terrified everyone who faced them. This wasn't just a military force, it was a perfected war machine, every component designed to maximize killing efficiency while minimizing logistical weakness. And now this weapon was aimed at the civilized world. The Jin dynasty in China, the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, the Kievan Rus in Eastern Europe, and beyond them, all of Western civilization, none of them understood what was coming. None of them were prepared, and none of them would survive unchanged. Before we continue with the bloodbath, if you want to support this channel and get exclusive Wars in History merchandise, shirts, hoodies, and posters featuring the most brutal battles in history, check out the link in the description. Now, let's watch empires fall. In 1211, Genghis Khan turned his gaze toward the Jin dynasty, the Jurchen Empire that controlled northern China and ruled over tens of millions of people from behind the Great Wall. The Jin were sophisticated, wealthy, and militarily powerful. They commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, equipped with advanced siege weapons, gunpowder bombs, and elite cavalry units. Their cities were protected by massive stone walls and complex fortifications that has withstood centuries of nomadic raids. They viewed the Mongols as just another barbarian tribe from the steppes, troublesome but manageable. They could not have been more mistaken. Genghis Khan didn't invade with a single massive army. He divided his forces into 3 columns, each commanded by his most trusted generals, and attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The Khan himself led the central column straight through the heart of Jin territory, moving between the Great Wall and the Yellow River. His sons and generals led the flanking columns, coordinating their movements across hundreds of miles with terrifying precision. The Jin had never faced an enemy that could operate with such coordination across such vast distances. Their military doctrine assumed enemies would advance along predictable routes towards specific targets. The Mongols were everywhere at once. The opening phase of the war was a masterclass in mobile warfare. Mongol Tumans swept across Jin territory like a storm, avoiding heavily fortified cities and instead targeting smaller towns, supply depots, and agricultural regions. They burned crops systematically, destroying the food supplies that Jin cities depended on. They slaughtered livestock, poisoned wells, and demolished irrigation systems. They captured Jin officials and officers, extracting information through torture before executing them publicly. Within months, northern China was experiencing a famine that would kill more people than the actual fighting. In August 1211, the Jin made their first major attempt to stop the invasion at the Battle of Yihuling, committing approximately 150,000 troops, 65,000 cavalry and 85,000 infantry, to a defensive position in the mountains. The Jin commander, Wanyan Jujin, positioned his forces to block the mountain passes, confident that the narrow terrain would negate the Mongols' mobility advantage. For days, Mongol forces probed the Jin defences, launching small attacks that were repulsed with heavy Mongol casualties. The Jin believed they were winning. They were being baited into a trap. Genghis Khan sent a force under Ogedei, one of his most brilliant generals, on a flanking march through terrain the Jin considered impassable. For 3 days, Ogedei's Tumen navigated narrow mountain trails, leading their horses by hand through sections too steep to ride, moving at night to avoid detection. They emerged behind the Jin army, positioning themselves to strike the Jin rear and supply lines. When Yebe's force attacked, the Jin army was caught between two Mongol forces in terrain that prevented them from maneuvering. The result was a slaughter. Wanyan Jujin was killed in action. The Jin army disintegrated, and Mongol cavalry pursued the fleeing survivors for over 100 miles, killing them in groups as they scattered across the mountains. Casualties were catastrophic, with tens of thousands killed and the Jin field army effectively destroyed. The elite of the Jin military lay dead across the mountain passes, and the road to the Jin heartland lay open. With the field army destroyed, the Mongols turned their attention to cities. This presented a problem. The Mongols were masters of open field warfare, but siege warfare required different skills, different equipment, and different tactics. Chinese cities were protected by walls 30 to 40 feet high, made of rammed earth and stone that could withstand battering rams and catapults. Defenders could rain arrows, burning oil, and stones down on attackers from positions of complete safety. The first major city the Mongols besieged was Datong, the Jin western capital. The siege dragged on for weeks, with heavy Mongol casualties. During one assault, Genghis Khan himself was hit by an arrow and wounded, forcing him to lift the siege temporarily. The Mongols learned a crucial lesson. They needed siege technology. The solution came from captured Chinese engineers. The Mongols didn't kill skilled craftsmen and technicians. They enslaved them and put them to work building siege engines. Chinese engineers taught the Mongols how to construct trebuchets, catapults, siege towers, and battering rams. More importantly, they shared knowledge of gunpowder weapons, including thunder crash bombs, early rockets, and fire lances. The Mongols absorbed this technology with terrifying speed and improved it through systematic testing. Within 2 years, the Mongol army had transformed from a purely cavalry force into a combined arms military, capable of reducing the most heavily fortified cities in the world. By 1213, the Mongols stood before Zhongdu, the Jin central capital modern-day Beijing. The city was enormous, protected by walls 40 feet high and 20 feet thick, garrisoned by over 100,000 troops, and stocked with enough supplies to withstand a siege lasting years. Genghis Khan surrounded the city with 60,000 men and settled in for a long siege. The Mongols constructed trebuchets and catapults, bombarding the walls day and night. They diverted streams to flood sections of the city and contaminate water supplies. They built siege towers covered in wet hides to protect assault troops from arrows and burning oil, pushing them against the walls under cover of darkness. The siege of Zhongdu lasted for months, and the suffering inside the city became apocalyptic. Food supplies dwindled, then disappeared entirely. The starving population began eating leather, tree bark, and rats. When those ran out, they turned to cannibalism, with historical accounts describing markets where human flesh was openly sold. Disease ravaged the crowded population. Bodies piled up in the streets faster than they could be removed. The Jin emperor, Xuanzong, abandoned his own capital in 1214, fleeing south to Kaifeng and leaving the population to its fate. This act of cowardice destroyed what remained of Jin morale. In 1215, after negotiations and a tribute payment that the Jin never intended to honour, the Mongols discovered the emperor's betrayal and resumed the siege, with renewed fury. The city finally fell in June 1215, and what followed was one of the most brutal sacks in Chinese history. For 1 month, Mongol troops thoroughly looted, raped, and killed. Every building of value was stripped of treasures. The imperial palace was burned. Officials and aristocrats were executed, often after torture to reveal hidden wealth. Common citizens were slaughtered by the thousands. Historical accounts claim the city burned for more than a month, and the stench of rotting corpses could be smelled for miles. A traveller passing through the ruins years later reported that the bones of the dead were piled so high they formed hills that blocked the roads. But the Jin dynasty didn't die quickly. The war would continue for another 19 years, becoming a grinding war of attrition that consumed both sides. The Jin retreated south of the Yellow River, abandoning northern China to the Mongols, but building new defensive lines and raising new armies. Genghis Khan was called away to deal with threats in Central Asia, leaving the Jin campaign to his generals. The Jin survived through a combination of desperate defense, internecine Mongol politics, and sheer endurance. But they were already dead, they just didn't know it yet. The final phase of the Jin conquest began in 1230 under Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's successor. The Mongols formed an alliance with the southern Song dynasty, traditional enemies of the Jin, offering to partition Jin territory between them. This was classic Mongol strategy: turn enemies against each other, then betray the ally later. The combined Mongol-Song forces launched a coordinated invasion that the weakened Jin couldn't withstand. City after city fell. Jin armies were defeated in detail, their forces scattered and destroyed in running battles across northern China. The Jin emperor made his last stand at Kaizhou in 1234, surrounded by Mongol and Song forces. Rather than surrender, he committed suicide, and the remaining Jin forces fought to the last man. The Jin dynasty was extinct. The Mongols had conquered one of the most sophisticated and populous empires in the world. Northern China lay in ruins, its population reduced by millions through warfare, famine, and disease. The cities that survived were broken, their walls demolished, their treasuries empty. The Mongols had proven they could destroy civilizations, not just defeat armies, and they were just getting started. While the Jin campaign ground on, an incident in Central Asia would trigger one of history's most devastating military campaigns. The Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by Shah Muhammad II, controlled a vast territory stretching from modern-day Iran and Afghanistan through Central Asia to the borders of Mongolia. It was wealthy beyond imagination, controlling the Silk Road trade routes that connected China to the Mediterranean. Its cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Balkh, Merv, were legendary centres of learning, culture and commerce. Its armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Shah Muhammad considered himself the most powerful ruler in the Islamic world. He was about to learn what real power looked like. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan of 450 merchants to the Khwarezmian Empire, carrying gifts and a message proposing peaceful trade relations. The caravan arrived at the border city of Otrar, governed by Inalchuk, a relative of the Shah. Inalchuk, either suspecting the merchants were spies or simply motivated by greed, arrested the entire caravan, confiscated their goods, and executed all 450 merchants. When word reached Genghis Khan, he sent 3 ambassadors to Shah Muhammad demanding Inalchuk be turned over for punishment and restitution be paid. The Shah responded by executing 1 ambassador and sending the other 2 back with their beards burned off, an ultimate insult in both Mongol and Islamic culture. Genghis Khan's response was methodical, deliberate, and absolute. He spent months preparing for a campaign of annihilation. He assembled an army of approximately 100,000 to 150,000 of his best warriors, leaving sufficient forces in China to continue operations there. He gathered intelligence on every major city in the Khwarezmian Empire population, defences, water sources, political loyalties, military capabilities. He studied maps and reports from merchants, spies, and travellers. He planned supply routes and identified local populations that could be exploited for food and labour. By the time the Mongol army crossed the border in 1219, Genghis Khan knew more about the Khwarezmian Empire than Shah Muhammad knew himself. The campaign began with a strategic masterpiece. Instead of advancing along the expected southern routes where the Shah had positioned his main armies, Genghis Khan divided his forces and struck from multiple directions simultaneously. He sent a force under Yoshi, his eldest son, north to secure the Syr Darya river line. He sent another, force under Ogedei and Subutai, his two greatest generals, on a wide flanking march to the west threatening the Shah's rear. He personally led the main force directly toward the empire's heartland. The Shah, expecting a conventional invasion along predictable routes, suddenly found Mongol armies appearing hundreds of miles apart, moving faster than his scouts could track, coordinating their movements with impossible precision. The psychological impact was immediate. Shah Muhammad panicked. Instead of concentrating his forces to meet one Mongol army at a time, he scattered his troops across dozens of fortified cities, believing the walls would protect them. This was exactly what Genghis Khan wanted. Dispersed forces could be defeated in detail. Cities isolated from mutual support could be reduced one by one. The Shah had surrendered the initiative, and the Mongols would not give it back. The first major city to fall was Bukhara, one of the greatest centres of Islamic learning in the world, home to over 50,000 people, and defended by a garrison of 20,000 troops. Mongol forces arrived in February 1220, and the siege began with a terrifying display of power. Mongol trebuchets and catapults, operated by captured Chinese engineers, bombarded the walls day and night. Incendiary projectiles set fire to buildings inside the city. The garrison, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, attempted a desperate sortie to break through the Mongol lines. They were annihilated. The Mongol cavalry surrounded them and methodically killed every soldier, leaving their bodies in heaps outside the city walls as a message to the defenders. The civilian population opened the gates and surrendered, hoping for mercy. They received none. Mongol troops entered Bukhara and began a systematic looting that lasted days. Every building of value was stripped. Gold, silver, silk, jewels. Anything of worth was seized and loaded onto carts. The soldiers were separated from the civilians. Every member of the garrison who had survived the earlier sortie was executed. Skilled craftsmen, metalworkers, engineers, archers who could teach Mongol techniques were enslaved and sent east. Young women were distributed among the Mongol troops. The remaining population was enslaved or pressed into service as human shields for the next siege. Genghis Khan himself reportedly entered the city's Grand Mosque, which had stood for centuries as a symbol of Islamic civilization. He rode his horse up the steps and into the prayer hall, an act of deliberate desecration. According to accounts recorded by surviving witnesses, he declared to the assembled population, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Whether this speech is historical or legendary doesn't matter. It captured the perception of the Mongol invasion as an apocalyptic judgment, a force of nature that could not be reasoned with or resisted. From Bukhara, the Mongols moved on Samarkand, the capital of the Khwarezmian Empire, and one of the most magnificent cities in the world. Samarkand was far larger and better defended than Bukhara, with walls that stretched for miles, and a garrison estimated at 60,000 to 110,000 men. Shah Muhammad had fled before the Mongols arrived, abandoning his capital in a panic that destroyed the last shreds of his authority. When Genghis Khan's forces arrived in March 1220, joined by his sons Chagatai and Ogedei, who had just finished reducing Otrar, they faced the most formidable defensive position they had yet encountered. The siege of Samarkand demonstrated how completely the Mongols had mastered siege warfare. They constructed siege engines on a scale never before seen, with dozens of trebuchets hurling 600-pound stones at the walls from ranges of over 1,000 feet. They used captured population from previous conquests as human shields, driving terrified civilians ahead of assault columns to exhaust the defenders' arrows and forced them to kill their own people. They employed Chinese gunpowder weapons, including early rockets that terrified defenders and set buildings ablaze. They mined under the walls, collapsing sections and creating breaches that were immediately exploited by assault troops. Despite the garrison's size and the city's formidable defences, Samarkand fell in just 5 days. The garrison attempted to negotiate a surrender, offering to spare the city if they were allowed to leave with their lives. The Mongols agreed, then proceeded to methodically execute the entire garrison once they had surrendered their weapons and marched outside the walls. This was standard Mongol practice. Promises made during sieges were not binding once the city fell. The civilian population was treated with relative leniency compared to Bukhara. They were merely enslaved rather than massacred. Skilled craftsmen were identified and sent to Mongolia. The city's treasuries were emptied. The magnificent libraries were burned, destroying manuscripts and texts that dated back centuries. But the worst was yet to come. The city of Nishapur would become synonymous with Mongol terror. In November 1220, during the siege of the city, Genghis Khan's son-in-law Tokuchar, husband of his daughter Toks, was killed by an arrow fired from the city walls. The Khan's daughter demanded vengeance in a form so absolute that history would never forget. When Nishapur finally fell in April 1221, the Mongols carried out what may be the most thorough massacre in human history. Nearly every living thing in the city was killed. Men, women, children, infants. None were spared. Even animals were slaughtered. Dogs, cats, horses, camels, chickens. Everything that moved was killed. The city's population, estimated by some accounts at 100,000 to 200,000, though likely exaggerated according to some contemporary accounts, was methodically executed over several days. Each Mongol soldier was reportedly assigned a quota between 10 and 50 people to personally kill, with the heads counted to verify compliance. The bodies were piled in massive heaps, then the heads were removed and stacked into pyramids. Separate pyramids for men, women and children arranged outside the ruined city as monuments to terror. The ground was ploughed over. The irrigation canals were destroyed. The walls were demolished stone by stone. Nishapur wasn't just conquered, it was erased. Travellers passing through the region years later reported finding nothing but empty plains where one of Central Asia's greatest cities had stood. The message was clear. This is what happens when you kill a member of Genghis Khan's family. The psychological impact reverberated across the Islamic world. Cities hundreds of miles from the fighting began surrendering at the mere approach of Mongol scouts. Shah Muhammad never recovered from the shock of the invasion. He fled west, pursued by a Mongol force of just 20,000 men under Jibian Subutai. This small force chased the Shah across Persia, through Azerbaijan, around the Caspian Sea, systematically defeating every army sent against them while gathering intelligence on territories the Mongols would conquer later. The Shah died as a refugee on an island in the Caspian Sea in 1220, broken and insane, having watched his empire dismembered in a matter of months. His son, Jalal ad-Din, attempted to continue resistance and even defeated a Mongol force at the Battle of Parwan in 1221. But Genghis Khan personally led reinforcements, crushed Jalal ad-Din's army at the Battle of the Indus River, and pursued him into exile in India. By 1223, the Khwarezmian Empire had ceased to exist. Its major cities lay in ruins. Its population had been reduced by millions. Central Asia, which had been one of the most prosperous and cultured regions in the world, was transformed into a wasteland dotted with pyramid cairns of skulls. The campaign had taken 4 years and resulted in devastation on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the world wars of the 20th century. Genghis Khan had sent a message to every ruler from China to Europe: submit or be annihilated. There would be no third option. Jibi and Subutai's pursuit of Shah Muhammad didn't end with his death. These two generals, commanding just 20,000 men, decided to continue west on what became one of the most audacious military expeditions in history. They weren't conquering territory. They were gathering intelligence, testing the defences of potential future targets, and demonstrating Mongol power to regions that had never heard of Genghis Khan. Over the next 3 years, this small force would defeat armies 5 and 10 times their size, terrify kingdoms across Eastern Europe, and prove that no army in the world could match Mongol tactical sophistication. The force swept through Persia and into the Caucasus Mountains, defeating Georgian and Armenian armies with contemptuous ease. They used the feigned retreat tactic repeatedly, drawing overconfident enemies into pursuits that ended in encirclement and annihilation. They moved at speeds that seemed impossible, covering 50 to 60 miles per day through mountainous terrain, appearing days ahead of where scouts reported them. Local armies, accustomed to slow-moving medieval warfare, couldn't adapt to enemies who moved like lightning and fought with coordination that suggested telepathy. In 1223, the Mongol force emerged north of the Caucasus onto the Russian steppes, where they encountered the Cumans, a Turkic nomadic people who controlled the region. The Cumans, recognizing a threat to their existence, fled west and appealed to the Russian princes for help. The princes of Kiev, Chernigov, Galicia, and other principalities assembled a coalition army of approximately 80,000 men, one of the largest forces medieval Russia had ever fielded. They were confident. They outnumbered the Mongols 4 to 1, fighting in their own territory, defending their homeland. They marched east along the Kalka River to confront the invaders. The Battle of Kalka River on May 31st, 1223, was a masterclass in Mongol tactical superiority. Jebe and Subutai deployed their forces in a thin screening line and waited for the Russian coalition to attack. When the Russians advanced, the Mongols immediately began a fighting retreat, loosing arrows constantly while falling back. The Russians, believing they were winning, pursued vigorously. Their formation broke apart as faster units outpaced slower ones. Cuman cavalry separated from Russian infantry, and the command structure fragmented as princes competed for glory. The Mongols retreated for 9 days, shooting backwards with the Parthian shot, inflicting a constant trickle of casualties, exhausting the pursuing Russians and leading them farther and farther from their supply bases. The Russian forces became strung out over miles of territory, their formations completely disrupted, their soldiers exhausted, their horses blown. Then the Mongols turned and struck. Hidden forces emerged from concealed positions on both flanks. The retreating Mongols wheeled and charged back into the scattered Russians. What had been a pursuit became an encirclement. The result was a slaughter of epic proportions. The Russian coalition was deliberately destroyed. Estimates of Russian casualties range from 40,000 to 60,000 men, with some sources claiming even higher numbers. The Mongol losses were minimal. Russian princes were captured, and the Mongols executed them in a particularly brutal manner. They were forced to lie on the ground, then wooden planks were placed over them, and the Mongol commanders held their victory feast sitting on these planks, slowly crushing the Russian nobles to death beneath them. This method of execution was reserved for high-ranking enemies, considered more honourable than beheading because it didn't spill noble blood. The surviving Russians fled west, in panic, spreading tales of an unstoppable horde from the east that could not be defeated. These stories reached every court in Europe. Kings and emperors heard descriptions of armies that moved faster than messengers could ride, that fought with bows more powerful than any European weapons, that executed tens of thousands with methodical efficiency. The reports were so extreme that many dismissed them as exaggeration. They would learn the truth soon enough. Jebi and Subutai returned to Mongolia in 1224, having completed one of history's great military expeditions. They had travelled over 8,000 miles, defeated every army they encountered, mapped the territories they crossed, and gathered intelligence that would enable the Mongol conquest of Eastern Europe 2 decades later. The expedition proved that Mongol military superiority wasn't dependent on overwhelming numbers. 20,000 Mongol warriors had defeated hundreds of thousands of enemies through superior tactics, discipline, and leadership. The weapon Genghis Khan had forged was even more devastating than anyone had realized. This demonstration of Mongol invincibility would haunt Europe for decades, but the great Khan himself would not live to see his armies return westward to finish what Jebi and Subutai had begun. Genghis Khan died in 1277 during a campaign against the Xixia kingdom, either from injuries sustained in a fall from his horse or from illness. Sources differ. He was approximately 65 years old and had spent most of his adult life at war. His death was kept secret for months to prevent enemies from taking advantage of the perceived weakness. His body was returned to Mongolia and buried in an unmarked grave that has never been found. According to legend, everyone who witnessed the funeral procession was killed to protect the location, and 40 slave girls and 40 horses were sacrificed to serve the Khan in the afterlife. But his death didn't end the Mongol threat. If anything, it made it worse. Genghis Khan had created a system that could function without him. His sons and grandsons had been trained in his methods, had commanded armies under his supervision, and shared his vision of world conquest. The Mongol Empire didn't collapse into civil war like most steppe confederations did when their leader died. Instead, it continued expanding, more organized and more terrifying than ever. Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's third son and chosen successor, became Great Khan in 1229. One of his first decisions was to finish what his father had started, the complete conquest of the Jin dynasty, which fell in 1234. Then he turned his attention west, authorizing a massive invasion of Europe. The force that would execute this campaign was led by Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, with the legendary Subutai now in his 60s, but still the greatest military mind of his generation serving as chief strategist. The Mongol invasion of Europe began in 1237 with the assault on the Kievan Rus principalities, already weakened and terrified from the Kalka River disaster 14 years earlier. City after city fell. Ryazan was captured after a 6-day siege and its entire population massacred. Vladimir was taken in 5 days. Moscow, then just a minor town, was burned to the ground. Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, fell in 1240 after a brutal siege and was so thoroughly destroyed that when the papal envoy Giovanni da Piandelcarpine passed through in 1246, he reported finding only 200 houses standing and skulls littering the countryside like stones. In 1241, Mongol forces invaded Poland and Hungary simultaneously, executing a coordinated campaign across a front stretching over 1,000 miles. This level of operational coordination wouldn't be matched in European warfare until the Napoleonic era. In Poland, a Mongol force defeated a combined Polish-German army at the Battle of Legnica on April 9, 1241. The European knights, charged with typical medieval bravery and typical medieval tactics, the Mongols' feigned retreat, drew the knights into an ambush and annihilated them. Duke Henry II of Silesia was killed, and according to Mongol custom his head was paraded on a spear. The Mongols collected the ears of the dead, filling 9 large sacks to send back as proof of their victory. But the main objective was Hungary, ruled by King Bela IV, whose kingdom controlled the Hungarian plain-perfect cavalry country that would serve as an ideal staging ground for further conquests into the heart of Europe. Bela had assembled one of the largest armies in European history, somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 men, including Hungarian cavalry that were considered the finest in Christendom. He positioned his forces on the banks of the Sajo River near the town of Mohi, confident that the river provided a natural defensive barrier. On the night of April 10, 1241, Subutai executed one of his masterpiece battles, while a Mongol force under Batu Khan created a diversion by forcing the main bridge across the river. Subutai led the main Mongol army on a night march to cross the river miles to the south, where Hungarian scouts hadn't even thought to patrol. The Mongols constructed a temporary bridge under cover of darkness and moved tens of thousands of cavalry across the river without detection. At dawn, they attacked the Hungarian camp from the rear. The Hungarians were caught between 2 Mongol forces with the river at their backs. Mongol trebuchets hurled incendiary projectiles into the camp, setting tents ablaze and creating panic. The Hungarian cavalry attempted to form up and charge, but Mongol horse archers shredded their formations before they could close to melee range. The battle devolved into a massacre. The Mongols deliberately left one escape route open, allowing desperate Hungarians to flee westward. This wasn't mercy, it was tactical brilliance. The fleeing Hungarians broke formation, abandoned their armour and weapons to move faster, and spread out along the road in a vulnerable column. Mongol cavalry pursued them for miles, shooting them down in groups, turning the retreat into a killing spree that lasted hours. Hungarian casualties exceeded 50,000 men, possibly as high as 70,000. King Bela IV barely escaped with his life. The Mongols proceeded to ravage Hungary for the remainder of 1241 and into 1242, burning towns, destroying infrastructure, and slaughtering civilians. The Hungarian plain, one of the most fertile and populous regions in Europe, was depopulated. Survivors hid in forests and mountains. Contemporary accounts describe the countryside as a wasteland dotted with corpses. The Mongols had demonstrated that European cavalry, tactics, and fortifications were obsolete. Nothing in Europe could stop them. Then, suddenly, they left. In December 1241, Great Khan Ogedei died in Mongolia. According to Mongol law, all princes of the blood had to return to the homeland to elect a new Khan. Batu Khan withdrew his forces from Hungary and began the long march back east. Europe had been saved not by military resistance but by coincidence and internal Mongol politics. If Ogedei had lived another 5 years, Mongol armies would likely have conquered Vienna, Italy, France, and possibly England. European civilization survived by accident. Under Mongke Khan, who became Great Khan in 1251, the Mongols resumed their expansion with renewed vigour. Monkey assigned his brother Hulagu to complete the conquest of the Middle East and destroy the Abbasid Caliphate, the religious and cultural heart of the Islamic world. What followed was one of the most significant military campaigns in history, one that would permanently alter the political and cultural landscape of the Middle East. Hulagu assembled a massive army, perhaps 150,000 strong, including Mongol Tumans, Chinese engineers, Persian conscripts, Christian Georgian and Armenian allies, and siege equipment on a scale never before seen in the region. His first objective was the elimination of the Nizari Ismailis, better known as the Assassins, a heretical Islamic sect that controlled a network of mountain fortresses in Persia and had long terrorized the region through targeted killings. The Assassins' mountain strongholds, built on seemingly impregnable peaks, had withstood conventional sieges for decades. The Mongols reduced them one by one over the course of 3 years from 1256 to 1258, using Chinese siege engineers to build trebuchets that could be assembled in mountainous terrain. The last assassin stronghold, Alamut, fell in 1256, and the assassin order was effectively destroyed. With the assassins eliminated, Hulagu turned toward Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate and the greatest city in the Islamic world. For 5 centuries, Baghdad had been a centre of learning, culture, and commerce. The House of Wisdom had preserved and expanded Greek philosophy and science. Its scholars had made ground-breaking advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature. Its libraries contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, representing the accumulated knowledge of Islamic civilization. The city was home to over 1 million people and was protected by substantial walls and a garrison of tens of thousands. The Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustasim, was weak, incompetent, and fatally overconfident. When Hulagu demanded his submission in 1257, the Caliph refused, apparently believing that the Muslim world would rally to his defence and that divine intervention would protect the seat of the Caliphate. No help came. The Muslim world was too fragmented, too weak, and too terrified of the Mongols to challenge them, and divine intervention was not forthcoming. The Mongol army arrived at Baghdad in January 1258. Hulagu's forces surrounded the city completely, cutting off all escape routes. When a sortie of 20,000 men attempted to break through the Mongol lines, Hulagu's engineers breached the Tigris River dikes, flooding the plain and drowning the Iraqi troops in their own defensive positions. The garrison, watching their comrades drown in the muddy fields, lost all will to resist. The siege tightened. Mongol trebuchets and catapults bombarded the walls day and night. Sections of the wall were undermined and collapsed. Assault towers were pushed against the fortifications. The Caliph, finally understanding his situation, attempted to negotiate. Hulagu refused. On February 10th, 1258, Baghdad surrendered. 3 days later, the Mongol army entered the city and began a systematic sack that lasted 2 weeks. What happened next remains one of the darkest episodes in human history. The soldiers of the garrison were separated from civilians and executed en masse. Thousands were herded outside the walls and methodically killed. The civilian population was initially spared, but when some residents attacked Mongol soldiers, Hulagu unleashed his army on the city. The Mongols went, street by street, house by house, killing everyone they found. Estimates of the death toll range from 200,000 to over 1 million, with the true number probably somewhere in between. The streets ran with blood. Literally, contemporary accounts describe blood flowing through the streets like rivers, and the Tigris River reportedly ran red for days from the bodies thrown into it. The destruction of Baghdad's cultural heritage was incalculable. The House of Wisdom and the city's libraries were burned. Hundreds of thousands of books, manuscripts, and texts accumulated over centuries were destroyed. So many books were thrown into the Tigris that contemporary chroniclers claimed the river ran black with ink, and Mongol horses could cross the river on a bridge of books. Scientific instruments, astronomical observations, mathematical texts, medical treatises, philosophical works, poetry, history, and entire civilization's intellectual achievements were reduced to ash. The loss to human knowledge was staggering, comparable to the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. Caliph al-Mustasim himself was executed in a manner that reflected Mongol customs regarding noble blood. He was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, a method that avoided spilling his blood directly on the ground. With his death, the Abbasid Caliphate, which had ruled the Islamic world for over 500 years, came to an end. The symbolic and spiritual center of Islam had been destroyed. The Islamic Golden Age, which had flourished for centuries, suffered a catastrophic blow with the fall of Baghdad in 1258, a symbolic and practical devastation from which it never fully recovered in the same form. The psychological impact reverberated across the entire Muslim world. If Baghdad could fall, if the Caliph himself could be killed, if the city that had seemed eternal could be reduced to ruins, then nothing was sacred, nothing was safe, and no power on earth could resist the Mongols. This realization induced a fatalism in Islamic culture that some historians argue persists to this day. Hulagu continued westward, conquering Syria and threatening Egypt, but was finally stopped by the Mamluks at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, the first major defeat the Mongols had suffered in over 50 years. But by then the damage was done. The Middle East would never fully recover from the Mongol invasions. Cities lay in ruins, irrigation systems were destroyed, populations were decimated, and the cultural and intellectual dynamism that had defined the Islamic Golden Age was extinguished. The Mongol Empire had annihilated empires across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. From the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea, from Siberia to India, no power had been able to withstand them. Millions were dead. Cities that had stood for centuries were erased. Entire civilizations were broken, and the Mongols had done it with a military machine built on discipline, mobility, tactical brilliance, and an absolute willingness to inflict terror on a scale the world had never seen. But the question remained, what was the true cost of this conquest? What did Mongol warfare actually mean for the people who experienced it? That is where we turn next, to the brutal truth that history often sanitizes but must never forget. Let's start with the numbers, because they tell a story that human language struggles to capture. Conservative modern estimates suggest that the Mongol conquest resulted in the deaths of approximately 40 million people over the course of the 13th and early 14th centuries. To put that in perspective, the world population at the time was estimated at roughly 400 million. This represents approximately 10% of the global population, a demographic catastrophe on a scale rarely matched in human history. That's equivalent to 800 million deaths, in today's population terms, more than World War I and World War II combined, multiplied by 3. But those aggregate numbers hide regional catastrophes that were even more devastating. China's population, which stood at over 100 million in 1200 under the combined Song and Jin dynasties, had collapsed to approximately 60 million by 1393, after the Mongol Yuan dynasty had been expelled. That's a loss of 40 million people over 2 centuries of Mongol rule and warfare. Northern China suffered the worst. Entire provinces were depopulated. Cities that had housed hundreds of thousands were reduced to villages. Agricultural regions that had fed millions were abandoned and returned to wilderness. The destruction in Persia and Central Asia was proportionally even worse. The Khwarezmian Empire had a population estimated at 15 to 20 million before the Mongol invasion. By 1260, after 4 decades of Mongol campaigns, conquests and misrule, the population had dropped to perhaps 5 to 7 million. That's a population loss of 70 to 75%. Some regions were virtually depopulated. The great cities of the Silk Road, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Balkh, Nishapur, which had been centres of culture, learning and commerce for centuries, were reduced to ruins inhabited by a fraction of their former populations. The historian Rashid al-Din, writing in the early 14th century from within the Mongol Ilkhanate, provided population figures for various regions before and after the conquests. He reported that the province of Khorasan, which had encompassed parts of modern Iran, Afghanistan and Turkmenistan, had its population reduced from 2.5 million to approximately 250,000, a 90% decline. The city of Merv, which had been one of the largest cities in the world, with a population that may have exceeded 1.2 million, was so thoroughly destroyed that it never recovered. Travellers in the 19th century found only ruins scattered across the desert where Merv had stood, but these numbers, as staggering as they are, don't capture the full horror. They don't tell you how those people died. They don't describe the suffering, the terror, the hopelessness that accompanied this demographic catastrophe. The Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir, writing in the 1230s about the Mongol invasions, struggled to find words adequate to the scale of the disaster. He wrote, "For even Antichrist will spare such as follow him, though he destroy those who oppose him, but these spared none, slaying women and men and children, ripping open pregnant women and killing unborn babes." Contemporary chroniclers who witnessed or heard first-hand accounts of Mongol conquests left descriptions that are almost unbearable to read. These weren't medieval propagandists exaggerating enemy atrocities. Many were Muslim historians writing within territories that would later be conquered by the Mongols, or Persian administrators who served the Mongol Khans and had access to accurate information. Their accounts corroborate each other across different regions and different time periods, creating a consistent picture of systematic brutality. Atta Malik Juvaini, a Persian historian who served the Mongol administration and travelled extensively through conquered territories in the 1250s, provided detailed eyewitness descriptions of the destruction. Writing about the aftermath of the Mongol conquest of Khorasan, he recorded, "They came, they sapped, they burnt, they slew, they plundered and they departed." But that understated summary was followed by graphic descriptions of specific atrocities. At Merv, he reported that the Mongols spent 13 days systematically executing the population after the city surrendered. The inhabitants were divided among Mongol soldiers, with each warrior assigned a quota of people to kill, ranging from 300 to 400 per soldier. Juvaini described how the soldiers would lead groups of people outside the city walls, force them to kneel, and then behead them with swords or axes. The work took days because the sheer number of victims overwhelmed the executioners. Bodies piled up in heaps, creating logistical problems for the executioners, who had to climb over corpses to reach the next group of victims. After the killing was complete, the Mongols remained in the area for several days, then sent a unit back to check for survivors hiding among the dead. Anyone found alive was killed. A group of refugees who had hidden in cellars and sewers emerged after the Mongols departed, only to be hunted down and slaughtered when Mongol patrols returned. Ibn al-Athir, though not an eyewitness, collected accounts from refugees and survivors across the Islamic world. His descriptions are filled with horror and disbelief. He recounted stories of Mongol soldiers who would enter a village, line up the inhabitants, and then methodically kill them one by one while the others waited their turn, too terrified to resist or flee. He recorded accounts of a single Mongol warrior entering a village of hundreds of people announcing he needed to fetch his sword, then returning to find the villagers still waiting, paralyzed by fear, allowing themselves to be slaughtered without resistance. These accounts might seem like propaganda or exaggeration, but they reflect a psychological reality of Mongol terror. The reputation the Mongols cultivated, the certainty that resistance meant not just death, but horrific death, not just for you, but for your entire community, created a paralysis that made resistance seem futile. Why fight when fighting meant watching your children murdered in front of you? Why resist when surrender offered the possibility, however slim, of survival? The Armenian historian Grigor of Akhna, describing the Mongol invasion of Georgia and Armenia in the 1230s, wrote of villages where every inhabitant was killed, their bodies left to rot where they fell. He described roads lined with corpses, valleys filled with bones, and cities where the stench of death lingered for months. He recorded that wolves and wild dogs became so accustomed to feeding on human flesh that they lost their fear of people and would attack survivors scavenging in ruined cities. One aspect of Mongol warfare that historical accounts often sanitize or mention only obliquely was the systematic sexual violence inflicted on conquered populations. After a city fell, Mongol soldiers were often granted days of unrestricted looting, killing, and rape. While practices varied by commander and circumstance, this pattern appears consistently enough in contemporary accounts to suggest it was an accepted part of Mongol military culture. The 3-day rule served multiple purposes. It rewarded soldiers for their service, it terrorized future targets into surrender, and it served as a form of biological conquest. The scale of sexual violence during Mongol conquest was unprecedented and systematic. When a city fell, women and girls were specifically targeted. Young women were separated from the general population and distributed among the soldiers. Contemporary accounts describe markets where captured women were traded, sold, and distributed like goods. The more attractive or higher status the woman, the more valuable she was considered. Noble women and princesses were taken as concubines by Mongol commanders. Craftsmen's daughters were given to skilled soldiers. Common women were distributed to rank-and-file warriors. But this wasn't just about immediate violence. It was about reproduction and conquest at a biological level. Women captured during Mongol campaigns were forced to bear children by their captors. These children were considered Mongol, regardless of the mother's ethnicity or the circumstances of their conception. This policy served to expand the Mongol population and spread their genetic lineage across the conquered territories. Modern genetic studies have confirmed the scale of this biological conquest. Research published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2003 found that approximately 16 million men alive today carry Y chromosome markers in their male lineage that trace back to Genghis Khan and his male relatives. Think about what that number represents. That's not 16 million descendants through normal population growth over 800 years. That's 16 million men who carry a specific genetic signature that can only be explained by systematic forced reproduction on a continental scale. Each of those 16 million men represents a lineage that began with a woman who was captured, enslaved, and forced to bear children by Mongol conquerors. The genetic evidence is a record of systematic sexual violence that affected millions of women across Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. The psychological and social impact of this violence extended far beyond the immediate victims. In many conquered societies, women who'd been assaulted were considered dishonored and were rejected by their own communities. Children born of these rapes faced discrimination and ostracism. Entire communities were traumatized by the knowledge that virtually every family had been affected. The shame and silence surrounding this violence persisted for generations, becoming embedded in cultural memory. Contemporary accounts occasionally provide glimpses of this suffering. The Secret History of the Mongols, the earliest surviving Mongol historical text, casually mentions the distribution of captured women as rewards, without any sense that this required justification or explanation. Persian and Arabic chronicles are more circumspect, using euphemisms like "the women were dishonored" or "taken as concubines," but the underlying reality was clear to contemporary readers. Later historians, often writing within Mongol-controlled territories, were even more careful to avoid explicit descriptions that might offend their rulers. The systematic nature of this violence is evidenced by Mongol military logistics. Armies travelling on campaign were accompanied by large numbers of enslaved women who served as camp followers, performing labour and providing sexual services to the troops. When cities fell, the captured women swelled these numbers. Women too old or too young to be useful were often killed along with men. Those deemed useful were forced on long marches to Mongol territories, with many dying of exposure, starvation, or exhaustion along the way. Those who survived the journey were sold in slave markets or distributed to Mongol households across the empire. One of the most psychologically devastating Mongol tactics was their systematic use of captured civilians as human shields during sieges. This practice, sometimes called hasha, forced labour, by historians, was documented across dozens of campaigns and became a signature element of Mongol siege warfare. The tactic served multiple brutal purposes simultaneously. It provided cover for Mongol assault troops, it demoralized defenders, it exhausted enemy ammunition, and it inflicted psychological trauma that undermined resistance. The process was methodical. When the Mongols approached a fortified city, they would first conquer the surrounding towns and villages, capturing the civilian population. These prisoners would be driven ahead of the Mongol army to the target city, where they were forced to fill in moats, construct siege equipment, and carry supplies under fire from the city's defenders. As the siege progressed, and the Mongols prepared to assault the walls, these civilians would be driven forward ahead of the attacking troops, forced to climb siege ladders and approach the walls under arrow fire. The defenders faced an impossible moral choice: kill their own people, possibly their own relatives, neighbours and friends, or allow them to reach the walls where Mongol troops would use them as cover for the assault. Most defenders chose to shoot. The psychological cost of killing your own civilians while knowing you were doing exactly what the Mongols wanted you to do was devastating. Some defenders tried to shoot over the heads of the human shields targeting the Mongol troops behind them. The Mongols responded by mixing their soldiers among the civilians, making it impossible to distinguish between forced participants and actual combatants. Contemporary accounts describe the scenes in heartbreaking detail. At the siege of Nishapur, Giovanni recorded that thousands of prisoners from surrounding towns were driven forward carrying siege equipment, while Mongol archers used them as mobile cover. The prisoners, knowing they would die whether they advanced or retreated, moved forward in desperate hope that the defenders would spare them. The defenders, watching their countrymen being forced towards certain death, faced psychological breaking points. Some defenders wept while shooting. Some refused to shoot and were executed by their own commanders for cowardice. Some shot themselves rather than continue killing civilians. The crush tactic also served a practical, military function beyond psychological warfare. By forcing civilians to carry out dangerous siege work filling moats with earth and rubble, pushing siege towers against walls, climbing ladders under fire, the Mongols preserved their own soldiers for actual combat. The civilian casualties during these operations were catastrophic, but from the Mongol perspective, those were enemy casualties, not Mongol losses. A siege that might have cost the Mongols thousands of warriors instead cost them hundreds while killing thousands of civilians in the process. After cities fell, survivors described watching family members forced to participate in the siege against their own city. Fathers watched their children used as human shields. Women saw their husbands forced to carry siege equipment under arrow fire. The trauma of these experiences were compounded by survivors' guilt, knowing that the only reason you survived was that someone else was forced to die in your place. This psychological devastation served the Mongols' strategic goals by ensuring that news of their tactics spread quickly, increasing the likelihood that future cities would surrender rather than endure a siege. The Mongols were among history's first military forces to deliberately weaponize infectious disease. The most famous and most consequential instance occurred during the siege of Kaffa in 1346. Where Mongol forces under Jani Beg besieged the Genoese trading post on the Crimean Peninsula. When plague broke out among the Mongol troops, killing soldiers by the thousands, the Mongol commanders ordered the corpses of plague victims to be catapulted into the city. The intention was clear: if we're dying of this disease, you will too. The contemporary account by Gabriel de Mussi, a Genoese notary who heard the story from survivors, described the scene. The Tartars, fatigued by such a plague and pestiferous disease, stupefied and amazed, observing themselves dying without hope of health, ordered cadavers placed on their catapults and thrown into the city of Kaffa, so that by means of these intolerable passengers the defenders might die widely. Thus there were projected heaps of slain, nor could the Christians hide or flee, nor be freed from such a disaster. Modern historians debate whether this tactic actually caused the plague outbreak within Kaffa. The disease was likely already present in the city through rat populations, but the intent to weaponize disease is undeniable. The tactic demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of contagion and a willingness to inflict mass death through any available means. The psychological impact of watching corpses hurled over your walls, knowing they carried deadly disease, was devastating. The defenders couldn't bury the bodies fast enough. Many were dumped into the sea, but the disease spread anyway. The consequences of this siege extended far beyond Kaffa. Genoese ships fleeing the city carried infected passengers and rats to Mediterranean ports. From there, the plague spread across Europe, killing between 75 and 200 million people over the next century, the Black Death. While the Mongols didn't intentionally cause the Black Death pandemic, and historians debate the extent to which the Kaffa siege contributed, their use of biological warfare at this critical trade hub may have accelerated the plague's spread into Europe. It represents one of the only cases in history where a military tactic at a single siege contributed to a continent-wide catastrophe. But Kaffa wasn't the only instance of Mongol biological warfare. Earlier campaigns included deliberate poisoning of water supplies in besieged cities, throwing rotting animal carcasses into wells, and allowing captured civilians to starve to the point of disease outbreak before releasing them into cities under siege. The Mongols understood that disease could be as effective as arrows, in reducing a city's population and breaking its will to resist. These tactics violated no contemporary laws of war because such laws didn't exist, but they demonstrated a ruthlessness that shocked even medieval observers accustomed to brutal warfare. The Mongol conquests didn't just kill people, they destroyed entire ecosystems and agricultural systems, causing environmental damage that persisted for centuries. This destruction was often deliberate, designed to ensure that conquered regions could never again pose a military threat, and that populations couldn't recover quickly enough to organize resistance. The most devastating environmental impact occurred in Persia and Mesopotamia, where civilization had depended on sophisticated irrigation systems for thousands of years. The Mongols deliberately destroyed these systems. During the conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, Mongol forces demolished Khanat's underground irrigation channels that brought water from mountain sources to agricultural regions. Without these Khanats, farmland that had been productive for millennia turned to desert within a generation. The destruction of the Khanat system in Khorasan turned one of the most prosperous agricultural regions in the medieval world into a wasteland. In Mesopotamia, the ancient irrigation canals that had sustained agriculture since Sumerian times were broken and left to silt up. The Narawan Canal, which had irrigated vast agricultural regions east of Baghdad, was destroyed during the Mongol conquest and never fully rebuilt. Dikes and water control systems along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were demolished. Without maintenance, these rivers shifted their courses, flooding some regions and leaving others without water. Agricultural productivity in Mesopotamia declined catastrophically and wouldn't recover until modern times. The environmental historian Ronald Siegel estimated that agricultural land under cultivation in Persia declined by as much as 90% during the century following the Mongol conquests. This wasn't just the result of depopulation. It was deliberate destruction of the infrastructure that made agriculture possible. The Mongols, coming from nomadic pastoralist culture, had no particular interest in preserving sedentary agricultural systems. In some regions, they actively encouraged the conversion of farmland back to pasture for their horses and livestock. The destruction extended to forests and wildlife. The Mongols practiced scorched earth tactics extensively, burning forests to deny cover to enemy forces, destroying orchards to eliminate food sources, and hunting game to near extinction in some regions. The environmental damage compounded the human casualties, ensuring that even survivors of the initial conquests faced famine, displacement, and long-term economic collapse. Chinese sources document similar environmental devastation. Northern China's agricultural infrastructure, which had been developed over thousands of years, was severely damaged during the Jin dynasty conquest and the subsequent decades of warfare. Irrigation systems were destroyed, terraced fields were abandoned and eroded, and forests were burned for tactical advantage. The Grand Canal, which had connected northern and southern China since the Sui dynasty, fell into disrepair during the Yan dynasty, disrupting trade and transportation for decades. The Mongol approach to cities was unique in military history. Most conquerors throughout history sought to capture cities intact because cities represented wealth, power, and administrative centers. The Mongols often chose to destroy cities completely, erasing them so thoroughly that in some cases their exact locations were lost to history. This wasn't random vandalism. It was calculated policy designed to break the power of sedentary civilizations and ensure that conquered territories couldn't organize effective resistance. When a city resisted Mongol ultimatums and was subsequently captured, the standard procedure was methodical and horrifying. The population would be divided into categories. Skilled craftsmen and artisans who could be useful to the Mongols were separated and enslaved. Young women were taken as concubines or slaves. Young men who could be conscripted into Mongol armies or used as forced labour were spared. Everyone else, the elderly, the young children, the infirm and most of the adult male population was executed. The executions were carried out systematically, often over the course of days. Soldiers would be assigned quotas. As already mentioned, each warrior had to personally kill a certain number of people, with the heads counted to verify compliance. This wasn't motivated by bloodlust or sadism, though those certainly played a role. It was bureaucratic genocide implemented with the same methodical efficiency that characterized Mongol military operations. The goal was to eliminate any possibility of resistance or rebellion by ensuring that the surviving population was too small, too traumatized, and too essential to the Mongols' economic needs to pose a threat. After the population was dealt with, the city's infrastructure would be systematically demolished. Walls were knocked down stone by stone, both to prevent the city from being used as a defensive position by future enemies and to send a message to other cities about the cost of resistance. Temples, mosques, churches, palaces, and public buildings were burned or demolished. Homes were looted of anything valuable, then destroyed. Irrigation systems were broken. Wells were filled in or poisoned. In the most extreme cases, the ground was ploughed over and sown with salt to prevent any possibility of rebuilding. The city of Merv provides the most extreme example. After its conquest in 1221, the Mongols spent approximately 2 weeks executing the population. Historical accounts claim that the population was massacred. Medieval sources claim 1.7 million deaths, though modern historians consider this impossible given the city's actual size of 100,000 to 200,000 inhabitants, though modern historians consider this number exaggerated. Even if the true number was half that, it still represents one of history's largest single massacres. After the killing was complete, the Mongols demolished the city's fortifications and destroyed its irrigation infrastructure. When Tolui, the Mongol commander, finally left the area, he left behind a detachment to ensure that no survivors could regroup and rebuild. Merv never recovered. The site was gradually abandoned and covered by desert sand. Today, archaeologists dig in the ruins of multiple cities built at the same location over thousands of years, with the Mongol-era layer representing the final occupation. Samarkand, one of the greatest cities on the Silk Road, was more fortunate it was allowed to survive, though greatly reduced. But the Mongols executed its entire garrison, deported skilled craftsmen to Mongolia, and demolished its fortifications. The city that had been a centre of Islamic learning and culture was reduced to a provincial town. Bukhara, another major Silk Road city, suffered similar treatment. Its famous library was burned, its madrasas closed, and its population decimated. The intellectual and cultural life that had flourished there for centuries was extinguished. In China, the pattern repeated across dozens of cities. The Jin capital of Kaifeng, when it finally fell in 1234 after years of siege and resistance, was so thoroughly destroyed that it ceased to function as a major city. Chengdu in Sichuan, which resisted Mongol conquest for decades, was finally captured in 1278 and its population massacred with such thoroughness that the city was essentially abandoned for years afterward. Historical records suggest its population declined from over 360,000 to fewer than 10,000. The empty city was eventually repopulated, but the original population, its accumulated knowledge, its crafts, its culture, was lost. Beyond the physical destruction, the Mongol conquests represented one of history's greatest episodes of cultural destruction. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, they destroyed not just a city, but the intellectual heritage of Islamic civilization. The House of Wisdom, which has been collecting, translating and preserving scientific and philosophical texts since the 9th century, was burned. Its library, which contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, was destroyed. Contemporary chroniclers describe Mongol soldiers dumping books into the Tigris River by the cartload. Witnesses claimed so many books were thrown into the river that you could walk across on a bridge of manuscripts. The river's water turned black from ink for days afterward. The loss to human knowledge was incalculable. Mathematical texts that explained algebra and trigonometry, astronomical observations collected over centuries, medical treatises describing surgical techniques, philosophical works, poetry, history, all reduced to pulp in the Tigris. But the destruction of Baghdad's libraries was just the most famous example of a systematic pattern. Across Persia, Central Asia and China, the Mongols destroyed libraries, universities and centres of learning. In Samarkand, the madrasas that had trained generations of Islamic scholars were demolished. In Bukhara, libraries accumulated over centuries were burned. In Chinese cities, temples and academies that preserved Confucian classics and Buddhist sutras were destroyed. The burning of books and the killing of scholars resulted in the loss of knowledge, literature and historical records that can never be recovered. The cultural destruction extended beyond books and buildings. The Mongols killed scholars, poets, scientists, artists and religious leaders in vast numbers. These weren't accidental casualties. Intellectuals and cultural leaders were specifically targeted because they represented the identity and cohesion of conquered peoples. A society without its intellectuals, without its cultural memory, without its religious authorities is much easier to conquer and control. The Mongols understood this intuitively and implemented it systematically. Languages and dialects disappeared. In regions where the population was decimated, surviving communities were too small to maintain distinct linguistic traditions. Over time, these languages died out or were absorbed into dominant regional languages. Local customs, oral traditions and cultural practices were lost when the people who remembered them were killed, and their communities were destroyed or scattered. Entire ethnic groups disappeared from history, absorbed into other populations or simply extinguished. The trauma of the Mongol invasions entered cultural memory in ways that shaped civilizations for centuries. In Persian and Arabic literature, the Mongol invasions became a reference point for ultimate catastrophe, the event against which all other disasters were measured. Chinese historians wrote of the Mongol era as a dark age, a period of barbarism that interrupted thousands of years of civilization. Russian chronicles remembered the Tatar yoke as a period of subjugation and suffering that lasted for over 2 centuries. These cultural memories shaped national identities as historical consciousness in ways that persist today. Here's the final, most disturbing aspect of Mongol warfare. It worked. The terror, the massacres, the calculated brutality, they achieved their strategic objectives with remarkable efficiency. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace that followed the conquests, created the largest contiguous land empire in history and enabled unprecedented trade, cultural exchange, and communication across Eurasia. The Silk Road reached its historical peak under Mongol rule. Merchants could travel from China to the Mediterranean with Mongol safe conduct passes, protected by the very military machine that had slaughtered millions. The Mongol Empire established a postal system that connected continents. They introduced paper currency and credit instruments that facilitated international trade. They practiced religious tolerance, protecting Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, and Taoist institutions. They employed administrators from conquered peoples based on merit rather than ethnicity. They sponsored art, architecture, and learning. In many ways, the Mongol Empire facilitated globalization on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. But this peace, this prosperity, this cultural flowering, it was built on piles of bodies. It was purchased with the blood of 40 million dead. It was established through terror so systematic and so overwhelming that resistance became psychologically impossible. The cities that survived did so because they surrendered immediately, because word had reached them of what happened to cities that resisted. The prosperity of the Silk Road resumed because the Mongols had killed anyone who might threaten trade caravans. The religious tolerance they practiced was possible because they had destroyed the political and military power of religious institutions. This is the brutal truth that makes the Mongol conquest so disturbing to contemplate. The violence wasn't senseless or random. It was calculated, effective, and in its own horrific way, rational. The Mongols understood that sufficient application of terror could replace years of conventional warfare. Why besiege 50 cities when destroying 5 so completely that the other 45 surrender without a fight? Why garrison every conquered province when you can create such fear that populations police themselves? Modern scholars still debate the Mongol legacy. Some emphasize the empire's contributions to global trade and cultural exchange. Others focus on the unprecedented death toll and cultural destruction. The truth encompasses both. The Mongols demonstrated that it's possible to build a functioning empire on a foundation of systematic terror. They proved that extreme violence, methodically applied, can create long-term stability, at least from the conqueror's perspective. They showed that civilians can be weaponized, that disease can be militarized, that terror can be systematized, and that genocide can be bureaucratized. These insights are deeply uncomfortable because they force us to confront questions about power, violence, and human nature that we'd prefer to avoid. The Mongols weren't uniquely evil. They were ruthlessly pragmatic. They identified the most efficient methods to achieve their objectives and implemented those methods without moral hesitation. They treated warfare as an engineering problem and solved it with horrifying effectiveness. That's what makes their story not just historically significant, but perpetually relevant. The impact of Mongol warfare extended far beyond the immediate casualties and physical destruction. The survivors and their descendants carried trauma that shaped cultures for generations. In Persia, the collective memory of the Mongol invasions created a cultural pessimism and fatalism that many historians argue influenced Persian literature, art, and philosophy for centuries. The great Persian poets who followed the Mongol invasions, Hafez, Sa'di, Rumi wrote in a world fundamentally altered by catastrophe, and their work reflects that reality. In China, the trauma manifested differently. The experience of foreign conquest by barbarians from the steppes created deep anxieties about Chinese identity and civilization that influenced political and cultural development through subsequent dynasties. The Ming dynasty, which overthrew Mongol rule in 1368, defined itself partly through rejection of everything associated with the Mongols. The restoration of Confucian values, the emphasis on Chinese ethnic identity, the rebuilding of the Great Wall all were responses to the trauma of Mongol conquest. In Russia and Eastern Europe, the Mongol invasions created historical memories that shaped national identities. The Tatar yoke, as Russians called the period of Mongol domination that lasted from 1240 to 1480, became a defining element of Russian historical consciousness. The experience of subjugation, of being cut off from Western European development, of having to pay tribute to foreign overlords, This created a sense of historical grievance and a determination never again to be vulnerable to invasion from the east. Some historians argue that Russian expansion into Siberia and Central Asia in later centuries was partly motivated by this historical trauma. For Islamic civilization, the destruction of Baghdad and the end of the Abbasid Caliphate represented a psychological and spiritual crisis from which the Muslim world never fully recovered. The city that had been the centre of Islamic learning and authority for over 500 years was reduced to ruins. The Caliph, who represented the spiritual leadership of Sunni Islam, was killed. The House of Wisdom, which had preserved and advanced human knowledge, was destroyed. The Islamic Golden Age, which had flourished for centuries and made groundbreaking contributions to science, mathematics, philosophy and medicine, came to an abrupt end. The trauma wasn't just psychological, it was demographic, economic and social. Populations that had been reduced by 50, 70 or 90% took generations to recover, if they recovered at all. Economic systems that had depended on trade, agriculture and urban centres were disrupted for decades or centuries. Social structures that had provided stability and continuity were shattered. The knowledge, skills, and cultural traditions that resided in dead populations couldn't be easily replaced. Children who survived the conquests grew up in worlds fundamentally different from those their parents had known. They grew up surrounded by ruins, hearing stories of cities that no longer existed, learning trades from the few surviving masters, inheriting trauma they hadn't personally experienced but carried nonetheless. These children passed their trauma to their own children, creating generational cycles of fear, anger and grief that persisted long after the Mongols themselves had faded from power. This is the harsh reality that history textbooks often sanitize or skip over entirely. Warfare isn't just about battles, strategies, and political outcomes. It's about human beings experiencing unfathomable suffering. It's about children watching their parents murdered. It's about women being raped systematically as military policy. It's about men being forced to kill their neighbours to meet execution quotas. It's about entire populations being worked to death building siege equipment to attack their own cities. It's about cultures being deliberately erased through the murder of everyone who carried them. The Mongol conquests weren't an aberration. They were warfare stripped of moral constraints and pursued with maximum efficiency. They show us what human beings are capable of when power is unchecked, when killing is systematized, and when empire building is pursued without regard for human cost. The Mongols didn't invent genocide, biological warfare, systematic rape, or cultural destruction, but they perfected these practices, implemented them on an unprecedented scale, and demonstrated their effectiveness. This is why studying the Mongol conquest matters, to understand what warfare actually means in human terms. When we read that a city fell or an empire conquered a region, we must understand the reality behind those sanitized words: mass death, systematic rape, enslavement, orphaned children, and destroyed cultures. The Mongols achieved their objectives. They built the largest land empire in history. They facilitated global trade and cultural exchange. They established administrative systems that governed hundreds of millions of people. And they did it by killing 40 million human beings, by destroying thousands of cities, by erasing cultures, and by creating trauma that echoed through centuries. That's the harsh reality of the Mongol conquests. That's what makes them both historically significant and perpetually disturbing. They succeeded by being more ruthless, more systematic, and more willing to inflict suffering than anyone who came before them. And perhaps most disturbing of all, their methods worked. The terror they created was so overwhelming that it replaced the need for constant military presence. The destruction they inflicted was so complete that resistance seemed futile. The empire they built on corpses lasted for over a century and shaped Eurasian history for far longer. This is the lesson that tyrants, conquerors, and would-be empire builders have learned from the Mongols throughout subsequent history. Sufficient application of terror and violence can achieve political objectives. The question isn't whether it works. The question is what kind of world such methods create and whether we're willing to accept that cost. The Mongol conquests show us humanity at its most ruthlessly efficient and most horrifically brutal. They show us what happens when martial excellence and strategic brilliance are combined with absolute moral indifference. They show us that civilization is fragile, that cultures can be erased, that populations can be decimated, and that progress can be reversed. They show us that the glory of empire is built on the suffering of those who are conquered. They show us the true face of warfare, stripped of romanticism and propaganda. That's the brutal truth. And it's a truth we must never forget, because forgetting it means we're condemned to repeat it. The Mongol horde annihilated the world. Not metaphorically, but literally, they destroyed civilizations, killed tens of millions, and altered human history through systematic application of violence. Understanding how they did it, why it worked, and what it cost is essential to understanding not just history, but human nature itself. Because the capacity for such violence, such ruthlessness, such systematic brutality, it hasn't disappeared. It's still within us, waiting for the right conditions, the right leaders, the right justifications. The Mongols showed us what we're capable of. The question is whether we've learned anything from that demonstration. From 1206 to 1368, the Mongol Empire dominated Eurasia through military brilliance married to calculated terror. Genghis Khan and his successors built the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, from Siberia to Southeast Asia. They accomplished what seemed impossible. They conquered China, destroyed Persia, subjugated Russia, and terrified Europe. They created administrative systems that governed hundreds of millions of people. They established trade networks that connected continents. They practiced religious tolerance and sponsored cultural achievements that influenced art, architecture, and literature for centuries. But that empire, those achievements, that historical legacy, it was purchased with the blood of 40 million dead. It was built on the ruins of thousands of destroyed cities. It was established through massacres so systematic that entire regions were depopulated. It was maintained through terror so overwhelming that resistance became psychologically impossible. The Mongol conquests represent warfare at its most efficient and most brutal, a demonstration of what human beings can achieve when moral constraints are removed and violence is pursued with absolute commitment. The Mongols showed us that military superiority comes from discipline, organization, training, and tactical innovation combined with ruthless pragmatism. They showed us that terror, methodically applied, can be more effective than conventional military force. They showed us that empire building is measured not in victories but in the suffering inflicted on those who are conquered. They showed us the true cost of conquest, not just in casualties and destruction, but in trauma that echoes through generations. We study the Mongol conquests not to glorify them but to understand them, to understand what warfare actually means in human terms, to understand what happens when power is unchecked and violence is systematized, to understand that civilization is fragile, that cultures can be erased, and that progress can be reversed, to understand that the capacity for such brutality remains within us, waiting for the right conditions, the right leaders, the right justifications. The Mongols were humans like us. What they did, we could do. That's the most disturbing lesson of all. This is how the Mongol horde annihilated the world. Through superior organization, tactical brilliance, technological adaptation, and absolute ruthlessness. Through feigned retreats and psychological warfare. Through human shields and biological weapons. Through systematic massacre and cultural destruction. Through terror so overwhelming that surrender seemed preferable to resistance. They didn't just conquer, they erased. They didn't just defeat armies, they destroyed civilizations. They didn't just win battles, they broke the will of entire continents. The harsh reality of Mongol warfare is that it worked. The terror achieved its objectives. The massacres prevented future resistance. The destruction eliminated threats. The empire flourished. And that success, purchased with unimaginable suffering, is what makes the Mongol story so significant and so disturbing. Because it demonstrates that extreme violence can achieve political and strategic goals. The question isn't whether such methods work. History has answered that question. The question is whether such brutality can ever be justified, and whether we're willing to accept that cost. The Mongols are gone, their empire fractured, their armies disbanded, their tumens dissolved into history. But their legacy remains, in the genetic signatures carried by millions, in the ruined cities scattered across Eurasia, in the cultural memories that still shape nations, in the historical lessons that we must never forget. The Mongol horde showed us what happens when warfare is stripped of moral constraints and pursued with maximum efficiency. They showed us what we're capable of. Whether we learn from that demonstration or repeat their methods in new forms, that's the choice every generation must make. This has been the story of annihilation, the story of how one man and his descendants built an empire through systematic application of violence, terror, and destruction. The story of 40 million dead, thousands of destroyed cities, and civilizations erased. The story of the harsh reality of warfare that history often sanitizes but we must never forget, because forgetting this truth means we're condemned to repeat it. If this documentary has opened your eyes to the brutal reality of warfare and the darkest chapters of military history, I need your support to keep creating content like this. These deep dive documentaries take weeks of research, script writing, and production. Unlike mainstream history channels that sanitize warfare and glorify conquest, Wars in History shows you the harsh reality, the blood, the suffering, the human cost that gets erased from textbooks. You can support this channel directly through Ko-fi. The link is in the description below. Every donation, no matter how small, helps me continue producing these uncompromising historical documentaries. Your support means I can keep researching, writing, and revealing the stories that need to be told. The wars that shaped our world. The campaigns that killed millions. The brutal truth that history tries to hide. This is Wars in History. And this is what warfare actually looked like. Thank you for watching. If this documentary impacted you, leave a comment below. Share it with others who need to understand what conquest and empire truly mean. And remember, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. Never forget the 40 million who died during the Mongol conquests. Never forget what humanity is capable of. Never forget the brutal truth. Until next time, this is Wars in History, showing you warfare as it actually was. No glory, no romance, just blood, suffering, and the annihilation of worlds.